Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. Today I am going to cover a very interesting topic called trigger framework in Apex. Let's start the video. So in this video we'll be going to cover the trigger framework using the abstract classes. So before going into the trigger framework, let's first understand the abstract classes. So there are multiple types of classes in Apex. So the very first one is the concrete classes. The second one is abstract classes. The third one is interfaces. So the difference between all these three types of classes are pretty straightforward. The concrete classes are the fully implemented classes. And the abstract classes are partially implemented classes, and interfaces are fully unimplemented classes. What does it mean? So in the concrete class, you can't be able to declare the methods. So you have to implement all the functions or methods. While in the abstract classes, you can fully implement the method as well as you can partially or maybe unimplement the method by adding a keyword called abstract. So you can create the abstract methods as well, so which will be considered as a unimplemented method. In case of interfaces, the functions and methods will always be unimplemented, so you will only be going to declare the methods. So let's look into the abstract classes. So in order to create the abstract classes, you have to include the keyword as abstract, and then it will become the abstract classes, and nobody can able to create the instance of this class. So I have created couple of different methods over here based on the context of the trigger. For example, before insert, after insert, and so on. So all these methods are abstract methods. So it means it is unimplemented. So the child of this particular class trigger framework abstract will be going to implement all these methods. So the purpose of the creation of these methods is to provide the flexibility to all the child classes to implement all these methods. And in this particular class, I have also created one interesting method called execute. This is a static method, so we don't need to create the instance to to call this particular method. Now let's look into the custom metadata type ones. So I have also created a custom metadata type called trigger framework. So this will be used to fetch the information very quickly to get the information about the particular handler class. So in this particular metadata types, I have created 3 different fields, and you can create more fields based on your use cases or scenarios. So I have created 3 important fields. The first one is handler class, which will be going to store the name of the class. This will be the text field. The second one is the active checkbox field, which will actually be going to control whether you want to run a particular handler class for a trigger or not. And the third one is the object. So in order to distinguish a couple of different handler classes for a particular object, you can distinguish by using the object. So by the time being, I have created one record of this custom metadata type, and the record which I have created is for the account trigger. The name of this custom metadata type is account handler 1. So the class of this handler class, this trigger handler is account trigger handler, and it is currently is in active state, and the object is account. So this is the information that I really need in our apps trigger framework abstract class to call the multiple handler classes. So the purpose of the trigger framework is to follow the best practices of triggers. For example, like single trigger on a single object. So that is one of the best practices. So it will be going to make sure that single trigger will be implemented on a single object. So now let's look into the implementation of this trigger framework by looking into this execute method. So as you know, like in the custom metadata type, I've created a object field called so for this record we have the value as account. So in order to fetch this information, we have to somehow retrieve dynamically the value of the object name, right? Because it might there could be multiple triggers on the multiple objects, right? So we have to somehow retrieve the value of the object name. So this could be done in a couple of different ways. So I have used the predefined method called getSObjectType, which will be present inside uh, the list class. So trigger.old, as you know, like trigger.old will always be going to return the list of s object. So in the list object, we have the predefined method called getSObjectType, and I'm typecasting this value to a string.value of. So it will going to convert the value of getSObjectType to a string. So the return type of getSObjectType is SObjectType itself. So in order to convert the SObjectType to a string, I have typecasted this value by using string.value of. Now you can see I have used the ternary operator over here in order to check the value. So there are basically two different scenarios. So the one of the scenario is so so in so in couple of different trigger context, the value of the trigger dot new will always be not equal to null. For example, insert, update, or undelete and undelete. So in these three contexts, our trigger dot new value will not be equal to null. So we can get the value of our object name from this trigger dot new, but there is only one scenario where we will not be able to get the value based on trigger dot new. That scenario is the delete one. So that's the reason first I am checking trigger dot is delete. If the scenario is trigger dot is delete, it means the trigger dot new value will always be null. So that's the reason I have used this trigger dot old value instead of trigger dot new. The purpose of trigger dot old and trigger dot new is pretty straightforward. It will be going to fetch the list of s object. So the return type will always be the same, right? At the end of the day, we are just retrieving the object name out of it based on the s object type and typecasting that particular value to a string. So in this particular line, we are clear that we are just retrieving the object name. And after that, we are making the query to our trigger framework metadata, which we have already created. So I'm retrieving two different fields from the metadata, which is ID and handler class, and retrieving all the handler classes which are currently in the active state, and by passing the object name. So retrieving all the handler classes for a particular object which is currently in the active state. And there is a predefined field called trigger dot operation type, which the return type of this particular, so the type of this particular field is enum, and it is going to return the system dot trigger operation, and this is just a enum value. So this will actually be going to help us to check in which context we are currently in. That's the reason I have extracted the trigger dot operation type, storing it into a variable called trigger op. Now I'm looping through each and every custom metadata type, and also I am creating an instance of our handler classes dynamically. So there is a very important class called type, and inside the type uh, we have a method called for name, which accepts one parameter where one argument as a string, So you have to pass your handler class name, so for which you want to create the instance of. And so this particular part will be going to return the type itself, and there is uh, one more method called new instance, which will going to help us to create the instance dynamically. And I'm typecasting that particular instance to our trigger framework abstract. So why I am doing this? Because this trigger framework abstract class will always be the parent of all the handler classes. So let's look into one of the example over here. So I have created a account trigger handler class, which is the handler class of our account trigger, which is extending our trigger framework abstract class. So basically, this extend keywords is basically help us to create the relationship between our parent class and the parent-child relationship by using the inheritance. So we are using the inheritance over here to create the parent-child relationship. So parent can able to store the child instances. So this is also known as the runtime polymorphism. And based on the polymorphism, you can store your child instance in your parent class, although it is a abstract class. So as I said, like abstract class, you can't be able to create the instance. So we are not creating the instance of our trigger framework abstract. We are just creating the instance of our handler classes by passing the handler class itself. So the purpose of this particular line is to create the dynamic instance of our handler class and typecasting it to our parent class, which is a trigger framework abstract. So until here we are clear that we have created our instance dynamically and storing it into our the abstract class itself. And then I have used the switch case over here to check in which context we are in. So I've already mentioned trig op is going to store the enum values, and it is helpful for us to figure out which context the current transaction is going on. So if it is a before underscore insert, it means we are in the before insert context. So we can call our before insert method, which I have marked it as abstract. So the one who will be the child of this particular class will actually be going to write the logic. So as I mentioned, account trigger handler is the child of our trigger framework abstract. So as soon as you will extend this trigger framework abstract class, it will be going to throw some error if you will not implement any one of this method. So you have to implement all the abstract methods. So this is the property of abstract class itself. So I'm calling the before insert method by passing the trigger dot new value, and after insert is also taking this trigger dot new value. In the insert context, we don't have the trigger dot old value, and in context of before update, so one uh, one might work on both trigger dot new map as well as old map. So I'm passing all these four context variables and so on. So this is the logic of our execute method. So now let's look into the so this is our logic of our execute method. Now let's look into the trigger, one of the example of our trigger. So I've created the account trigger, and I have declared all the context variable in the argument. So uh, so initially you might not need all the context variables, but again at the end of the project you might need it. That's the reason I've declared all the context variables. And the template of the trigger will always be the same. So you have to call a single, you have to write on a single line, which will be eventually going to call the execute method inside the trigger framework abstract class. So in order to call a execute method, you don't need to create the instance. That's the reason I've created the execute method as a static method. So that is pretty straightforward. And let's look into the implementation of the method. So I have just written a single line which will be going to print uh, the print one statement. So I have distinguished the statements by writing a different context, for example, before insert, after insert, and so on. So let's test this functionality once. Let me go into the uh, anonymous window and try to insert one account by passing the name as test, and let's see whether our trigger framework will be able to call our account trigger handler or not. Let's check the logs as well. So I'm executing this particular line, so it executed successfully. Let's check the debug only. So it is showing us the two different debug statements: insert inside before insert and inside after insert. So it successfully executed both the lines: system.debug inside before insert and inside after insert. I think it is working pretty straightforward. And let's try to create one more trigger on the contact. So let me put the name as contact trigger, and let's select the contact over here. Okay, so let me copy paste all the context variables here, save it, and as I mentioned, we have to follow the same template. So you will only be going to write the single line called trigger framework abstract.execute. This method will eventually going to handle everything itself. The only thing is that we have to write our logic inside our handler class, right? So somehow we have to create one class which will be the contact trigger handler. Let's create it, and so this class will going to extend uh, this class trigger framework abstract. As soon as I will extend this, I'll get the error saying you have to implement all the abstract methods which are defined in the class. So let me copy paste all the methods from the trigger handler, account trigger handler. Okay, so let's save it. So I have implemented all the abstract methods. So now so there are no problems. Let's try to execute this contact trigger as well. So before that, we have to include this handler class in our metadata. So that's the reason I've created the metadata as well. So over here I am going to include contact handler 1. So there might be uh, multiple handler classes for a particular trigger, right? So for now I am assuming that there is only one handler class, and this is our handler class name, and it will be eventually. So object is just a picklist field. I have included manually all the possible object name. So currently I have added all the standard object. You can add the custom object API names as well, and based on that it will be going to handle our trigger framework will eventually be going to handle everything based on our handler classes. Now let me try to create a new contact record. So as we know, like in order to create the contact record, we need to fill this last name field. Let's try to execute. It executed successfully. Let's check the logs. So you can see again we are printing the same thing: inside before insert and inside after insert. Let me do one thing. Let me change the inside before insert contact. Let me change the debug statements for now for both This will be after. So there will be a clear distinction between both the both the both the method both the account trigger handler as well as the contact trigger handler. Let me execute one more time. Let's close the previous logs. So you can see there are again two different debug log statements: inside before insert contact and inside after insert contact. I think that's all from my end. Thank you for watching my video.